Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So, um, thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to talk about understanding and measuring well-being across cultures. So today I'm going to talk about three topics. The first one is about measuring well-being at the individual level. By individual level, I mean when we measured well-being of people, a group of people, and we want to talk about people. And the second and third sections are going to be about measuring the well-being of nations. So let's start with the first section. What is well-being? And we need to ask this question. It's not an exaggeration if I say there are tens or hundreds of concepts that you can call well-being concepts, well-being variables, or these are components of well-being. So do we have a model, a system for these variables to make sense of them? Yes, we have some models, and this is the model that I like and I want to talk about today. I have called it sometimes the tripartite model of well-being, but three-dimensional model of well-being also is a good title for this model. According to this model, well-being has three components. Hedonic well-being, we also call it subjective well-being. This consists of life satisfaction and positive affect and low negative affect. So it's about how you feel and think about how you judge your life and how you feel in your life. The second component is psychological well-being. This one is about certain psychological skills that you have and you use in your life. So having them and using, such as autonomy, such as having purpose in your life, having meaning, producing meaning in your life, doing meaningful activities. So we call it psychological well-being. And then there is the another component, social well-being. This one is about your relationship with the groups, communities that you have. Do you have a sense of belonging? And do you think that you are living in a good society and you are contributing to your society? Now, the second and third one are about functioning, how you are functioning psychologically and socially. And the first one is more about feeling. So feeling and functioning, right? So we call it the three-dimensional model of well-being, and each component is developed by different researchers, multiple researchers, but the person who put all of them together and called them, recognized this as a comprehensive model of well-being is Corey Keyes, who is originally a sociologist. Now, I like this model because it's very comprehensive. And when I tell you a little bit about my results, it has other advantages, such as not only it's comprehensive, but we have good cross-cultural validity data on this model. So here you can see the components of different aspects of well-being. Subjective well-being has life satisfaction and affect balance. Then psychological things such as purpose, autonomy, sense of growth, continued growth. Social well-being, it's like social integration, social contribution. So we have these variables. Now, if you forget about the model and theory, then you have just a list of variables and it's difficult to make sense of them. But this model helps you to understand in a comprehensive system all these dimensions. So this was initially introduced as just a model, a theory, and we needed to test it. So I started doing, me and other researchers started doing a lot of studies. I specifically pursued two lines of research here. One of them was factor analysis studies. So if we input these variables, like 13 variables, 14, 12 variables, and factor analyze the data, do we get 3 latent variables? And the answer is yes. Usually we find in factor analytic studies, we usually find support for this model. And we get 3 latent variables: subjective, hedonic, psychological, or and social. And the correlation is usually at least moderate, but usually strong. So these latent variables, they emerge. And we have distinct latent variables, but they are highly correlated. So correlated but distinct. Now, one criticism was that the correlation is too high, and I suggested using exploratory structural equation modeling. This is a kind of factor analysis that allows for cross loadings in the context of structural equation modeling. And after removing these 0 constraints on cross loadings, then we get smaller correlations between the latent variables. So in many countries, I personally, me and my colleagues, we have tested this model in at least 7 countries, I think, and always we find supporting evidence. Of course, we never find perfect support. That doesn't exist in the world of real data analysis. And then in other studies, multidimensional scaling, again, 3 clusters emerged in multidimensional scaling studies, as you can see here. So, so far, my conclusion is that this model is consistent with data across many countries. Actually, something else, the multidimensional scaling studies also provided more insights. For example, I was able to extract 2 underlying dimensions, like all these well-being variables, 2 underlying dimensions. And I believe this provides an integrative framework for understanding well-being at the personal level. Each variable can be put somewhere on this dimension from social to personal. So for example, autonomy is personal, and then we have social well-being variables that are very social. And also another dimension is eudaimonic, psychosocial functioning. And hedonic is about life satisfaction and feelings, right? So you can make sense of all these variables. And so this offers a 2-dimensional framework to understand well-being. And you can use it as a basis for theorizing and measurement. The last slide I want to talk about is just in the context of factor analysis, I looked at the centrality of these variables, as you can see, psychological, social, and hedonic variables. And I don't have much time to really talk about what I mean by centrality, but just imagine higher correlation with all other variables. And it turns out that self-acceptance and environmental mastery, something like competence, these are the most central variables, and autonomy is the least central. Also, I found a very simple way to calculate cross-cultural variability in the context of factor analysis. And it turns out that social well-being variables are more variable across cultures. So the factor loadings changes from culture to culture. Anyway, this is mental well-being. This is one of the best models we have, well-supported models that we have of mental well-being at the personal level, 3 latent variables. All right, so I was curious about the national level. So now here we are talking about individuals. We get these 3 dimensions, these 3 latent variables. What if we study nations? So the unit of analysis is not people now, it's nations. What kind of factor structure can we expect at the national level? There was a problem. I couldn't possibly even think about it because there was no measure of psychosocial functioning at the national level. And without that, I wouldn't test any model, really. So I decided first to develop a new measure of psychosocial functioning for 166 nations. So in this section of my talk, I want to introduce this index briefly. So I used the Gallup World Poll data, and I searched all the items, and I found 7 items that I used in many years, so I can use them. They are continuously used in a survey. And in terms of content, they are close to psychosocial functioning. So now these are the 7 items that I decided to choose for this new index. Well, you can debate it. You can say that these are not good items. We definitely can have better items. But when we are talking about 166 countries in a large survey, and given the fact that we don't have much space, given the fact that you cannot have 50 items to measure well-being in a global survey, and we just have a few items, I think we should lower our theoretical expectations and face the numerical realities. So I call these items proxy items for eudaimonic well-being. So the sample was massive, about 2 million people from 166 countries, and these are self-reports. And if you look at the factor loadings at the national level, very good. We do have a 1 factor structure here. So these 7 items together form a single factor, a single latent variable, and we can call that eudaimonic well-being or psychosocial function. And so let's look at the correlation of the new eudaimonic well-being index with specifically 2 variables: life satisfaction at the national level. And this is what in the World Happiness Report is usually called happiness. Well, that's not the best name for this variable, because this is about evaluating your life. So it's basically a life satisfaction or life evaluation index rather than a happiness index. But anyway, the correlation is 0.55 at the national level. So this means that they are correlated positively, but there's a large amount of non-shared variance between. More interestingly is the correlation between life satisfaction and GDP per capita, which is 0.82. It's a very high correlation. But the correlation between eudaimonic well-being and GDP per capita is 0.3. So eudaimonic well-being, psychosocial functioning is more distinct from economic development. We'll talk about this later. And I looked at the trend, a longitudinal trend from 2011 to 2016, and we see a slight but upward trend. So this good news, slightly increasing, at least between 2011 to 2016. This is the map that shows the scores of eudaimonic well-being. As you can see, North American and Western European countries are high on eudaimonic well-being, but also there are many countries in different parts of the world that have high scores on eudaimonic well-being. This one is life satisfaction. Let's look at them side by side. Now, this is eudaimonic well-being. The right side is life satisfaction. Some regions of the world, life satisfaction index doesn't help you much in distinguishing countries, such as in Africa. As you can see, almost all of the African countries are around midpoint of the scale or lower, midpoint of the distribution or lower. So the general conclusion is that, for example, when you are talking about Africa, that's there is not much well-being in Africa. But look at eudaimonic well-being. See, some countries have high eudaimonic well-being in Africa, and some of them have lower. So eudaimonic well-being, because we already talked that its correlation with GDP per capita is lower, so it's more distinct. And here you can see in less wealthy countries, eudaimonic well-being is more handy. It shows more, it gives more information for comparing these countries. Also in Central Asia, so it has some advantages, but the biggest advantage is that now we have a eudaimonic well-being, a global eudaimonic index, and now we can really start talking about the factor structure of well-being at the national level. And this is the third section of my talk. Now here I'm reporting on this study published recently with my colleagues, Welko and Tim, helped me a lot. So part of the data comes from the Gallup World Poll, and we used, and the data is from 153 countries. We used two samples. One sample, which is the main sample, is between 2015 and 2017, and we use another sample as a replication sample. So whatever we did in the main sample, we replicated in the replication sample, and everything was highly consistent. Okay, we brought a lot of external variables. For example, globalization index. We considered this a well-being variable, and it turns out to be one. Education, governance, safety, security, economic quality. So these are all the variables, national variables that we included in our factor analysis. And most of these variables here at the top come from the prosperity index. Prosperity index provides like 20, about 10 sub-indexes, and we use them to measure different aspects of prosperity at the national level. We also included life satisfaction, the latter question. This is the question that is used in World Happiness Report, and the same data is used by the World Happiness Report team. And then we had questions about affect. Did you smile? Did you laugh yesterday? Did you feel well rested yesterday? Did you experience enjoyment yesterday? And this is the eudaimonic index that I developed before. That was also included. Also future life satisfaction. So this one is present life satisfaction. They call it happiness. This one is future life satisfaction, 5 years from now. And you can call it a measure, future life satisfaction, or you can look at it as a measure of hope. So it's different a little bit from life satisfaction here. And also we had some items about negative feelings yesterday: sadness, worry, stress, and anger. So we did factor analysis, and the best model would be a three-dimensional model again. So at the national level, also we have three-dimensional model, but it's very different from the individual level model. Okay, the first factor is social and economic indicators, mostly dominated by these variables, such as globalization, education, health, business environment, personal freedom as a measure of democracy. Also, a surprising fact, loading here, life satisfaction, what they call happiness usually, or life satisfaction, the latter question, is also loaded here. And this was a little bit surprising for us. The second factor is psychological variables. Most of them, I think all of them coming from surveys, self-report surveys. And here we see eudaimonic well-being along with positive affect and some other indicators of positive experiences. So these are entirely psychological variables. And finally, negative affect formed a separate factor. And as you can see, the right side is the replication. The same factor analysis with the same variables in the replication sample, and the results are almost identical with some slight difference. Okay, we called the first factor socioeconomic progress. And the surprising thing about this is that life satisfaction, the measure that we usually use as a measure of psychological well-being in national studies, loaded on this factor. So it has, at the personal level, life satisfaction is completely psychological measure. It's subjective measure, but at the national level, it's functioning very differently. It's capturing essentially the economic status and economic status of a country. The second factor, these psychological variables, including eudaimonic well-being, we call it psychosocial functioning. And this is psychological variable dimension consisting of eudaimonic well-being, psychosocial skills, and also positive affect. And then negative affect, the last factor. So you see, it's different from the individual level structure of well-being variables. Here we have life satisfaction loads on a different factor than positive affect. At the individual level, positive affect and life satisfaction usually, and negative affect, low negative affect, they usually load on the same factor. But here we see life satisfaction is in this factor, positive affect is here, and negative affect is here. So we don't have a subjective well-being in the individual level sense factor. Then we have psychological well-being. Eudaimonic well-being loads with positive affect, and negative affect is a distinct dimension at the national level. The correlation between the factors are moderate. You can consider it the observed correlations. You can consider it strong, but latent variables are moderate or weak. And we see evidence of discriminant validity, and this is very important. For example, individualism. Socioeconomic progress has a very strong positive correlation with individualism, but psychosocial functioning, the correlation is very negative. Very weak, and even not significant. But the sample size is not very big. We should keep that in mind. Urbanity, percentage of urban areas, strong positive correlation with socioeconomic progress, and only a weak positive correlation with psychosocial functioning, and a very weak, relatively weak correlation with negative affect. And percentage of the population that aged 65 or more, strong correlation with socioeconomic progress, no correlation with psychosocial function, and a moderate correlation with negative affect. So you can see really here also we see differential relationships. Here also we see differential relationships. So these dimensions are really distinct from each other in terms of nomological network. And in some waves of Gallup data, not many, but in some of them, there were more interesting variables that we included. So life satisfaction, the latter question has been continuously used, and it's being used by the World Happiness Report team as well. But there was, I think in one, or I don't remember, but at least in 1 year, they also used this item, how satisfied are you with your life these days? And when we included that in life, in the factor analysis, it loaded on the same factor as the latter question. So basically, these two are measuring the same thing. There was a question specifically answering about experience of happiness yesterday, and that one loaded on the psychological factor, what we call psychosocial functioning. So happiness loaded here, not here. And also there was a question on purpose in life. As we expected, it loaded with eudaimonic well-being on this factor. So 4 surprising findings. We initially included income inequality, anxiety, and depression from the burden of disease project, and suicide rates. We included these 4 initially as well-being variables. So when we say well-being, we are not talking about nations. So basically quality of life, well-being, and prosperity. So we are talking about this broad concept. Income inequality, anxiety, depression, suicide. And we were convinced that these are not well-being variables. So they functioned unexpectedly in our analysis. For example, income inequality has a negative correlation with socioeconomic progress and a positive correlation with negative affect. Anxiety and depression are higher in countries with higher socioeconomic progress. And suicide was almost uncorrelated. It has a negative correlation with negative affect. We expected the opposite. So when we included these 4 variables in our factor analysis, the results were unexpected. Anxiety and depression loaded positively on the first factor. Income inequality loaded negatively on the first factor, or positively on the second factor. and suicide loaded negatively on the last factor. So as you can see, these four, sometimes in some researchers and even some projects, they include these variables as measures of well-being at the national level. But we argue that these are very important indicators. They are telling us something, important things about groups of people in different nations. But do they say anything about the general well-being of nations? Our conclusion is that no, they don't say much about well-being at the national level. And this is not just a theoretical claim, it comes from data. So our data are saying this, and we are just echoing that. Okay, I'm done with my presentation, but some resources. First, I will send you a link to a zipped folder. You can download all these slides and all the studies and papers that I talked about are there. So you can download with from that link. So all the studies that I talked about are in a folder. If you go to my website, you can see interactive maps of all these variables. Also, you can download the data, national level data. In this chapter, it's a very short chapter where I summarize these two studies, the eudaimonic well-being study and the structure of well-being at the national level study. I provide a summary of both, and I have a brief discussion about them. So if you want to see what I said in a written form, in the form of a chapter, this is what you can look at. So I will find an opportunity later to send you a link, and everyone can download all the materials I talked about today. Thank you so much.